Hey folks, I wanted to do a follow-up video for Moze because I feel like I'm just about wrapping up this character. I've cleared all the content in the game at this point, and I've done all the, proving grounds, all side missions, both playthroughs, all in Mayhem 3. And other than doing some final testing, which I'll talk about in this video, actually, I don't really have much left to do. So I'll probably be moving on to Zane next. I've already got a playthrough started with him, but there were some final things that I wanted to test and figure out on Moze before I moved on. One of the things that I tested earlier was regarding this Blastmaster Mod, because I haven't really seen anybody post any hard numbers on it, other than the fact that we know that it gives up to 100% splash damage. And one of the more useful testing spots is actually down here in Sanctuary, because there's no enemies around, and you can respawn a vehicle and shoot it. Now vehicles don't have any crit spots, so we can't test some things, but it is useful to test some damage things and related to Iron Bear and stuff. And what I found was that this class mod takes a full 50 seconds from the point of your last reload to reach 100% splash damage. So you get 2% splash damage per second after reloading, which is a fair amount of time. It's longer than I expected, actually. It still doesn't really change my evaluation of this mod too much. Most of the time you're using this, you're using it for mobbing, and the weapons that you use when you're mobbing most of the time, at least in my experience, you wind up never having to reload them. So regardless of how long it takes, it doesn't really matter that much. I also noticed in testing that the game seems to track the amount of time since your last reload, whether or not you have this equipped. It's not something that the mod itself seems to do. So for example, if I had been running around with my Minesweeper Mod for a minute, and I hadn't reloaded, and then I go back into my menu and I switch Minesweeper back into Blastmaster, it would still know how long it's been since my last reload, and I would probably already be at max splash damage. I'm not sure why the game tracks that stat on its own, but it does seem to. Which I suppose is worth knowing if you want to switch between mods while you're mobbing for some reason. As long as you haven't reloaded, you can still get the full effect of this right away. One of the other things I did test was the Minesweeper mod, because I wanted to try and get more detail about how the micro grenades work. And I found a couple things. The first thing I found was I verified that micro grenades do inherit the damage type of the strike that spawned them. So if you're using an incendiary weapon like this, for example, and you crit an enemy and spawn a micro grenade, the micro grenade will inherit the incendiary damage. So it does seem like you can double dip on elemental bonuses, in that the elemental bonus will improve the damage of the gunshot that triggered it, and then again apply to the damage of the micro grenade once it's spawned. The other thing I found was that the micro grenade inherits, it uses the base damage of the hit that spawned it to decide its own damage, which seems to be around 70% of the damage of the hit that caused it to spawn. So you are looking for a balance there of something that doesn't just fire fast or cause the maximum amount of strikes per second. You are looking for a balance of, what weapon does the most base damage while also firing the fastest and putting the most actual individual strikes on the target. I still haven't found anything better than the Butcher for that just yet. This has been my go-to boss killing weapon, especially for anything like Grave Ward or Tyrene or something where you have a big crit spot that you can load some sustained DPS into. What else did I test? I did do a quick test on this just to find out if there was some kind of minimum, like if there was a floor to this effect, and there's not. This skill starts out at a 0% gun damage bonus if your magazine is completely full, and then it scales proportionally as your magazine reaches 0, depending on how many points you have in this. I don't think... One thing I was trying to do was do some testing on Iron Bear's cooldown scaling, because I wanted, first of all, I wanted to know how much this actually affected your cooldown, because it doesn't say for some reason. And what I originally found was this was giving about a 35% cooldown rate while you were at full shields. And I think that's probably still accurate. But what I also found was there seems to be some kind of bug that I haven't fully isolated yet that is affecting the scaling cooldown of Iron Bear when it expires. Because if you know how Iron Bear works, when you get in it, you have this fuel gauge. And if you hold down B, you can eject from Iron Bear early. And when you do so, your cooldown, you can see how it started much higher. Your remaining fuel should have an impact on how much cooldown is remaining before your next Iron Bear. And so what I wanted to do was try to find some baseline, right? I wanted to know if I just sat in my mech and let the fuel drain out, what would my cooldown be, so I knew, you know, how much, you know, proportionally the ratio of remaining fuel to convert it into action skill cooldown. And what I actually found was that there seems to be some serious bug with, and I don't know if it's specifically this Guardian rank or not, or it has something to do with changing zones, but I had pretty different results without changing my skills. I did this these tests originally without skill points, and I found a really large variance. You know, the original test battery I ran, I was getting a duration of 90 seconds to be in the mech. Like, that's how long. That seems to be consistent. Your fuel will last 90 seconds if you're doing nothing, right? Normal movement does not seem to consume fuel any faster, so you could be in the mech for a total of 90 seconds. But obviously, while no movement seems to affect your fuel rate, obviously any kind of weapon you fire has a fuel cost. But while the 90 seconds seems to be consistent, the remaining cooldown, if you just sit here and let this expire on its own, I was getting different results without changing anything. And I don't know what's causing that. My original battery, I was getting 40 seconds cooldown if you let the mech expire. And then I was getting, I think, 25 seconds cooldown when I had a shield at full, utilizing topped off. But then I had another set of tests that were a full 35 seconds longer than that, without changing anything. So there does seem to be a pretty serious bug affecting Moze's cooldown for this skill. I haven't isolated whether it's specifically coming from my Guardian rank or if that's coming from some other kind of interaction here. I'll probably post that more. I'd probably post it on Reddit or something if I do totally isolate that. One other thing I did test, actually, now that I think of it, was the Rough Rider shield, because I wanted to know if the game considered this full or depleted, and what I found is it actually considers it neither, which is something that I found just by checking with this topped off skill. Your cooldown rate does not change when you have a Rough Rider equipped, which means that this skill, which is specifically looking for full shields, does not consider Rough Rider at full capacity, even though the capacity is 0. And I also have this Sprint Rough Rider, which is supposed to give you 10% movement speed while shield is depleted. This doesn't improve your movement speed. Like, you just have the same movement speed as you always do, so it's not considered depleted either. I'm not actually sure if it's considered anything, basically. Which is a little bit unfortunate, because it would have been nice to get a topped off bonus while wearing a Rough Rider. It is a pretty good shield for Moze, that notwithstanding. But the other thing I wanted to talk about in this video is just sort of some thoughts about characters' balance and some suggestions that I would make as far as future changes to Moze, because we can see that Gearbox is making some fairly rapid balance changes. I wouldn't call them knee-jerk. I don't really think much of that term, but they are trying to make adjustments pretty quickly here. We've already had 2 different balance adjustments in the first couple weeks, And so we know that they're going to be going through and making more of these as they prepare to launch the first significant piece of content post-launch, right? There's a Malawan raid, which will probably be the first instance of us getting a raid boss that's going to be coming in November or October or something. It's relatively soon after the Halloween event, is my understanding. And so I figured I'd make this video just to talk about where Moze is right now in the current state of, endgame, quote unquote, and what I think her biggest problems are, and some suggestions for how I would change them, because I do think Moze is in a little bit of a precarious spot right now. I do believe that as things stand, she is one of the most powerful characters that we have available to us. The thing is, the reason she's that powerful is dependent on a couple very specific synergies, and if she loses them with the wrong changes, then I think this character is going to be in a really weird place. I would say the first and most obvious thing, well, I think there's two things really that stick out for Moze. The first, and I would say the most obvious, is that Iron Bear's scaling is a problem, right? As you get into true Vault Hunter mode and start applying Mayhem modifiers, especially at Mayhem 3, Iron Bear does not scale at all. That is, when you hit level 50 and you enter true Vault Hunter mode, that level of offense and defense is where Iron Bear will be at, regardless of whether you bump it up to Mayhem 1, 2, or 3. However, on Mayhem, every rank of Mayhem increases the health and the shield and the armor of all the enemies. And then as you go into a zone, they'll get further modifiers to their enemy offense and things like that. And so ultimately, what happens is you wind up not wanting to use Iron Bear. Because the problem is pretty simple. When you activate Iron Bear, you're removing Moze from the battlefield and replacing it with Iron Bear. It's not like most action skills where you're performing an action that is complementary to your character's own damage. Like when you press Iron Bear, Moze literally disappears, and you're just in control of Iron Bear. So if Iron Bear does not remain as a force multiplier to Moze, it actually serves no fucking purpose. Like, this seems like a bizarre problem, right? It's such an obvious design concern that it seems strange that the question was not already asked and answered before we got here. Now, the question becomes how do you scale Iron Bear in a way that actually solves this problem? And the answer is, I don't know. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, they just need to improve Iron Bear's damage and armor, right? He needs to have vastly improved armor, and he needs to do a bunch more damage. But the problem is that he needs a way, well, I say he like it's a person. The mech needs a way to scale with some kind of variance. There has to be some kind of function that improves the mech's performance, because there will always be increasing there's going to be more content that comes out for this game. There will likely be, I don't know if it's going to be Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, some kind of similar mechanism to the overpower levels that were in Borderlands 2, just increased character levels, whatever it is. Moze's power is going to increase alongside this content. We get new character levels, higher power gear levels, whatever it is. If the mech does not scale with those things in some way, there's always going to be a point where Moze is more powerful than the mech. And as soon as that happens, the mech has no purpose. Like, I can't stress that enough. If you remove Moze from the battlefield, the mech has to be better than her, or it has no role. And so when they go to fix this, if they do not implement some kind of mechanism that actually serves as a force multiplier of however powerful Moze is at the moment, this is never going to be fixed. There's not a simple solution to that. And I honestly, this is probably the hardest problem for me to suggest a solution to, because there's no intuitive way, I think, to give the player a means to scale the mech off of gear, if that makes sense. Like, would I make it as powerful as my equipped weapon? You know? Does it take some kind of collective average of my gear's gear score or something? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there is a clean way to do this. But there does need to be some addressment to this, because the knock-on effect that this has is that it makes Moze's interaction with the anointment system terrible. You know, we have this endgame layer of gear, which is supposed to be superior to regular legendaries. And at the moment, Moze only gets value out of one anointment, really. Other than the generic ones to some extent. Which is this one, that grants a damage buff to the next 2 magazines. This one has value because it has no real time limit. Like, I can make, with this character, I can make the next 2 magazines last the entire zone, right? So this has value. If I could get this on a hostile to butcher like this, I would probably use my Iron Bear at least at the start of a zone and just get 40% free bonus incendiary damage. Although with a butcher, you may find yourself reloading twice in the same zone, but maybe not within the same boss fight. But certainly, if you had like an anointed laser sploder or an anointed flacker, you could make those magazines last for the entire zone, no problem. But all these other anointments, they have this serious problem of, why do I care? Like, I have to take the opportunity cost of clicking the button and going into my mech. I don't want to be in the mech. It's literally flimsier than me, and it certainly does less damage than me. It being flimsier than me is not that serious of a problem in the context of it's a temporary thing anyway, and it's not hitting my character, so it's okay if it's only going to last for like 15 seconds. But if it doesn't do more damage than me, then I don't give a shit how flimsy it is, right? So there has to be some fix for this so that Moze can gain meaningful access to her anointments. It's like, just like all the other characters. The other characters have great access to these anointments, and they have a reason to think about them. Whereas I actually don't really care about whether I find an anointed piece of gear or not. And I think it's a big problem, and I think it makes farming gear as Moze a little bit boring. Because it's like, you know, I have this irradiated, like this anointed flacker, but I use this one because it's radiation 2, and it just has better parts. And I feel like that's really sad. I think it's really sad that this character does not have a reason to engage in sort of the last tier of gear chase. And it really needs to be fixed. I think one of the more simple, if, you know, not ideal solutions would probably involve Iron Bear, or this auto bear for Iron Bear, to where you could, they could make it to where you could hold down the button for your action skill and have Iron Bear drop down directly into Auto Bear, like just basically like dropping down a turret. And so this way I could trigger my action skill without having to get in the mech, you know, without having to deal with the opportunity cost of doing shitty damage or just losing 5 seconds climbing in and immediately jumping out of the mech pointlessly. I mean, it's not clean, and on some level would probably force endgame builds, not just now but down the road, into picking up this auto bear skill. But it is probably the only way I see to sidestep the issue of whether the mech has satisfactory scaling at all levels and all gear levels, but still giving her access to her anointments. So I think in the short term, that's probably what I would do, just to alleviate this problem of Moze having shitty access to anointments. And at the very least, it would also make Iron Bear some level of a DPS cooldown. It would always serve as some kind of DPS increase regardless of Moze's gear level, because this thing can apply a debuff, and the mech is going to do some level of damage on its own, and then you can just be shooting next to it. So that would probably be the easiest solution, but there does need to be some secondary solution that allows the mech Even if just in the short term they have the mayhem modifiers apply to Iron Bear and things like that, and treat him almost like an enemy in terms of enemy scaling as difficulty increases, maybe that would help. It's not going to solve that core issue, because when you really have excellent gear, you know, you're gonna hit levels of scaling that aren't gonna make those changes super relevant to you still. But that's what I'd like to see happen to Iron Bear. The other issue, and sort of the elephant in the room, I think, for Moze, is the issue of grenade synergies and how they interact with Tesla coil grenades. You know, right now, pretty much every Moze Endgame build, and I think at least most good ones, have these 21 points into Demolition Woman, because the synergy between Tesla coil grenades and these two skills, Means of Destruction and Vampire, are incredibly powerful. On some level, it seems like they were, you know, aware of this, in the sense that Moze's class mod, even for her Shield of Retribution tree, involves converting healing into shields. Well, she doesn't have any means of healing outside of Vampire. So if it wasn't for this interaction, I don't know what it would have been for. But I think it's probably also fair to say that the level of grenade regeneration in particular feels a little bit broken, right? Personally, I don't necessarily think the amount of healing coming out of Vampire is really the problem, right? I think it's her access to grenades that makes this feel out of control. Like, she should be able to heal a crap load by hitting enemies with grenades. But if she can also throw grenades forever, that seems like a problem, right? And I feel like that's the thing that they're going to have to address if they do inevitably want to sort of rebalance Moze. And it's going to have to come through Means of Destruction, I think, and not Vampire. I will say that if they do change this, and I think when I say change this, what I'm ultimately referring to are grenades like the Hex. The Hex, the Stormfront, and I guess to some level the Quasar, but these two in particular, right? These two types of grenades here, the way they work, if you haven't used them, is when you throw them and they hit an enemy, they generate a Tesla coil, right? Like a beam of electricity, and it attaches to a target. Because that Tesla coil is sourced from a grenade, it is technically, you know, tagged as splash damage. However, if we're being honest, right, if we're just looking at this objectively, these are not splash damage sources. It's not possible for the Tesla coil to hit more than one enemy. It actually has to specifically attach itself to an enemy. And when it doesn't have the capability to hit more than one target, it's pretty questionable that this damage is considered splash damage, right? Especially when these Tesla coils hit multiple times per second. You know, this is a recurring hex, which means 6 grenades come out basically every time I throw a grenade, which is 6 instances of, you know, multiple damage over time sources, every tick of each beam having a chance to trigger both Vampire and Means of Destruction. And this seems like the interaction that probably was not, you know, properly vetted in testing. Now, on the one hand, look, Borderlands is a series that's had some pretty broken shit in it. And on some level, you could argue that that's part of the point. You know, Salvador's existence for the entirety of Borderlands 2 would be some testament to that. But I have a feeling that they're going to want to pursue balance to a slightly higher degree this time, in hopes of extending the relevance of content in the game as they go forward for a little bit longer. Because Salvador, in particular, was never challenged by anything, ever, right? He was basically just immortal and did insane damage, and did whatever the fuck he wanted. Now, I don't think Moze, or this interaction, is really anywhere near Salvador's brokenness level. But it does seem something like that's broken. Because we have to question as to whether a Tesla coil should really be considered splash damage. And if I'm being honest, I think it probably shouldn't. And what it would fix is this overabundance of access to her grenades. And so when they do this, I'm concerned that they're going to basically over impact her ability to heal from Vampire, which I think would be a mistake. I think Moze in particular needs that because between mech cooldowns, assuming they ever make mech worth a shit, you know, she's particularly vulnerable. Even when you're investing into Shield of Retribution, shield dynamics are a little bit different than health dynamics. And without that class mod and her ability to heal, shields are kind of a tricky thing to rely on sometimes. So if this gets fixed, I think I would almost specifically just be nerfing this means of destruction and only be doing that by fixing the grenades counting as splash damage when they're hitting with a Tesla coil. There might need to be some improvement to the grenade chance, in fact, when this happens. Or maybe you need to have this be, you know, 20% of missing health per second for 3 seconds or something to make sure that she can, when throwing less grenades, she can still get a similar amount of healing. But something there feels like it should probably change. You know, especially when you have... The game actually seems like it has trouble when you really overload a zone with grenades. I've seen instances where the healing from Vampire just stops if I sit there and throw recurring hex over and over and over and over onto only a small handful of targets. There's so many Tesla coils trying to attach to an enemy that the game just stops calculating the healing. And it can take, you know, 3 or 4 seconds before the game remembers, oh, yeah, now there's not quite as many grenades in the air and I can figure out what the hell's going on. And there probably just shouldn't be. I mean, the grenade capacity is pretty high in this game, so I worry that that's going to be an issue, you know, regardless of what they do. But this definitely seems like something that is likely to get nerfed. And when they do nerf it, I just hope that they nerf it in a way that reduces her sort of infinite amount of grenades without also ripping the healing out of Vampire or nerfing it to the point where we're going to wind up with too much pressure, I think, to not just spec Shield of Retribution, but also get saddled to that class mod, which is going to cut her off from an enormous amount of damage. But there are other things, though, with Moze that I think could stand to be buffed or changed alongside this, right? Outside of the Iron Bear. I mean, all of these talents here that involve Iron Bear, their viability is explicitly tied to Iron Bear. So if there are significant improvements to Iron Bear, we probably won't need to revisit these. They're going to just get much better by association. This skill here, why can't I carry all these grenades, I think would have been much better if this was the source of her grenade generation instead of this, right? Like, this could be some means of regenerating grenades that, because grenade capacity currently is totally fucking pointless, right? We regenerate so many grenades that why would I care about having 3 more, especially at the cost of 3 entire skill points, right? So if they do nerf this interaction, I would like to see, what I would really like to see is regular grenades getting some much improved capacity of grenade regeneration to open her up to using more grenades other than these Tesla coils, right? Which is one of the reasons when I was suggesting maybe this should be giving health over a few seconds. If she's going to be throwing less grenades, especially with grenades like Epicenter, for example, is an extremely high damage grenade. But it only hits once or maybe twice, 3 times if you have like a spring Epicenter or a jumping Epicenter or something like that. I think regular grenades need a little bit better chance of, you know, generating grenades. Obviously, you have splash damage guns that have a chance to generate a grenade, but it feels like that should be coming from grenades specifically. Everything else in this tree, I think, is working okay. Other than, okay, this was something I wanted to talk about too. Torg cross promotion. I definitely would not be taking this skill if there was something else worth a shit to be taking above it or on the same tier. What this skill needs, in my opinion, just like Axton had, and I'm not sure, you know, he had it and they just forgot that this was an idea, but this needs some kind of splash damage mitigation, or at least some kind of mitigation against her own damage. Because what this skill typically does is get me killed by myself. Like, this is so much more frequently a penalty to me than it is a boon. So I would like to see, like Axton had, some kind of scaling mitigation per point against either splash damage or just even specifically her own damage, so that I could use a flacker while slightly moving forward and not blow my own face off. Also, Hammer Down Protocol. Again, since all of these are kind of related to Iron Bear, this is all going to be dependent on Iron Bear changes, but this nuke in particular, 380% of a single rocket is actually not very good. Like, the damage value on this is missing like an entire digit. I don't know why anybody would use this at the moment. And even if Iron Bear did, like, if you increase Iron Bear's damage globally, I'm still going to be using things like lock and speed load, because the relative DPS of this is going to go through the roof. This thing just sucks. So add a 0 would be my suggestion. This is one of those, I thought this was going to be sort of the counterpart to Axton's nuke, where he just got a giant detonation when he placed a turret, but this is pathetic in comparison to that. So I would like to see something more akin to nuke from Axton, where, yeah, I don't get to do area, or like, I can't attack very rapidly, but I have this one button that's going to drop a gigantic bomb on most of the screen. So this tree is working okay. There's only a few things I take issue with in this tree. Number one, Russian offensive really felt underwhelming. I wish this increased her movement speed, and I would probably be taking it right now if it did. One of the things Moze lacks terribly is any kind of mobility in her trees. And the ability to sprint and shoot at the same time sounds neat in theory, but in practice it does very little. In particular because this does not allow her to sprint and throw grenades. If you press the grenade button, she will stop sprinting. And right now, because Moze is so dependent on her grenades, this feels really pointless. But even if her dependency on grenades is peeled back a little bit, I'd really like to see this get some kind of movement speed improvement, so she has at least a little bit of mobility to work towards. This ability, Click Click, I mentioned this in the build guide. I feel like this skill was designed backwards, and I really would like to see this reversed so that it did the 36% when you are at maximum magazine capacity, and then the damage bonus drained out as your magazine drained out, which would further encourage synergy between skills like Match Set and Iron Bank and your ammo regen talents to try and, you know, incentivize you to stay closer to the top of your mag, right? To be able to fire and still be at a high position in your magazine. That makes a lot more sense to me, and I also think this would just make this a lot more enticing as a skill. At the moment, it's pretty boring because there's no floor to this, right? If you, like I mentioned at the start, if you're at full mag, this confers 0% gun damage. And there are weapons, like for mobbing purposes, like a laser exploder or a flacker, who are pretty much going to be near the full point of the magazine at all times. You can't actually offload ammo fast enough to get them any lower. So this just almost does nothing for them. If my primary boss killing weapon wasn't a butcher, I might even skip this entire skill. So I'd like to see this flipped on its head and work in the other direction. Scrappy is one that I think could have been another place for movement speed, because this one feels a little bit, this is more of a knock-on effect of the way the game is balanced right now, or at least for this character. Like, weapon swap and mode switch really don't feel like interesting bonuses, because most of the time we're going to be sitting on one or two weapons, especially in this tree, because it's encouraging us to pump our magazine and our ammo regen to points where we don't need to switch weapons, right? And I don't feel like the content in the game is doing much of anything to really encourage you to switch weapons often to fight like particular enemies and things like that. You might switch your loadout at the start of a zone if you have mayhem modifiers pushing you, say, into assault rifles or shotguns or something in particular, but you're not going to be doing it as a function of like, oh, I'm going to fight badass tinks with this. I'm going to fight badass zealots with this. It's just really not how it works. So this feels pretty weak to me. But this is another place where maybe movement speed would have made this a lot more enticing. Specialist Bear is another one that just like Iron Bear is going to have to be better for this to mean anything. And this Some for the Road talent, I think this is just lame. And it's lame because there's an anointment that does the exact same thing. Right? Infinite ammo for 5 seconds after you exit Iron Bear. And they don't stack. So this really just feels like get a free anointment for a skill point. And I don't know, you could solve that in, 2 different ways, right? You could change the anointment or change this, but do something, right? I didn't see that on any other character where they're just like, well, the anointment's just a skill point in some skill tree. And it felt really lame. I will say this isn't actually the worst, like this isn't useless, neither the anointment or this, if you, are at lower levels of gear, but you have access to, Crazy Earl's vending machine, where you can get like a decent Torg rocket launcher that has a really low mag size, but has a huge sticky bonus and a decent fire rate. And you can use this to like get in Iron Bear and immediately get out and just stick a crapload of stickies in 5 seconds, and then shoot the remaining end of the magazine, and you'll do a massive amount of burst damage. It gives you a way to farm a boss like Grave Ward, or some other high DPS target who doesn't have a lot of immunity phases that maybe you wouldn't otherwise be able to farm efficiently. But otherwise, this is pretty dumb, and I just think that either the anointment or this has to change. It's really corny looking to me that there's an anointment that literally grants this skill. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was Forge. I really just don't like how this feels so similar to Redistribution. It really just feels like a second rank of Redistribution in practice, especially if you have, crits coming from grenades or something. I'd like to see this do one additional thing besides ammo regen. I don't know what that thing is. Designers get paid to think of a lot of cool ideas, but it could really do anything. I really just want this to do something else besides ammo regen. We already have a talent specifically for ammo regen, and it has 100% uptime in practice. This needs to do something neat. I don't care what the thing is, just do it. This needs to feel more unique, basically. And for Shield of Retribution, I don't know. I'm of 2 minds on this skill tree, right? On the one hand, what I feel like this tree could use is a little bit stronger identity, right? Like, there is a lot of synergy in the skills as far as shields are concerned. And you even have some very intentional gear synergies with the things like the class mod that converts healing into shields, and you have the artifact that reserves more health but gives you more shields back, things like that. But on the offensive side, all of the offensive increases in this tree feel pretty random to me outside of Desperate Measures. And even that, this is based on health instead of shields. So it's like, this really railroads you, I feel like, into the whole reserving all of your health kind of concept. But like, this Phalanx Doctrine, besides having a shitload of bugs, by the way, this skill needs fixed. This skill allows you to infinitely stack any kind of shield modifier that is based on reaching full shields, which is a fucking problem. Somebody ought to get on that quick. Unless you really like infinite speed Moze walking around the planet in 2 seconds. This one too just felt like it was so strangely placed. I don't know why this is in Shield of Retribution compared to something like Bottomless Mags. I guess it's negative fire rate, but this skill also has a fire rate improvement that would have offset that. I don't know. I just feel like this tree lacks some kind of interesting identity, and is too married to concepts like Vampire and Demolition Woman, and too railroaded in its gear choices for endgame. I haven't played this tree as much, if I'm being honest. I don't really care for it as much. I haven't invested as much time in the other 2 trees, but I do think it needs to be some kind of like some kind of better identity on the offensive side of this tree, because it just feels very random to me. Like, yeah, this one improves gun damage but lowers your fire rate. I don't know why. And there's some incendiary bonuses, even though, you know, the other incendiary stuff is elsewhere. And then there's like this random gun damage when you kill guys. Why? I don't know. It doesn't feel like a very like synergistic tree to me, except on the defensive side. But the defensive side is also so linked to such a specific combination of items that it would probably benefit this tree if it had a little bit more standalone utility in, you know, something like Vampire for shields, I guess, or the class mod was accomplishing something that it didn't need to reach deep into another tree to actually do. Because it feels like if you're going to play Shield of Retribution and you're going to do so without Vampire, like, I don't know, it doesn't sound like a very good time to me. So yeah, I feel like we obviously need Iron Bearer buffs. I think that's known. But I still think that regardless of, you know, if you look at the way they buff Zane, no matter how much they buff Iron Bearer, I think the problem's not going away unless the whole concept of how Iron Bearer's damage is boosted changes. Because the stronger I get, the less I want to hit this button. And that's sort of like an inherent problem. It's like just like a design problem they've painted themselves into a corner on. I want to improve Moze's power, and the more I do that, the less I want to hit this button. So there has to be some like pressure valve there that will allow me to keep my access to anointments and not make me dependent on wanting to use this mech for damage. Unless you give me a means to make this mech always more powerful than my character for the purpose of damage explicitly. If you can't do that, give me some way to access my anointments without giving a shit how much damage it does. One of those two things has got to happen, or this remains a problem literally forever. And then the other thing I think is there's going to have to be some reduction in her access to grenade regeneration when she's using Tesla coil grenades. I'd like to see her retain her healing ability even when she gets less access to grenade generation, but it stands to reason, I think, that Tesla coils, they're not capable of hitting more than one enemy. They really shouldn't be considered splash damage regardless of whether they're coming from a grenade or not. I will say, on the point of Tesla coil grenades, I'd really like to see them fix the issue that prevents them from working on like the majority of boss targets in this game. I don't know what causes that, but even a human-sized enemy like Katagawa Jr., he literally is just a random human-looking guy. They won't attach to him. They will float up there, and they will detonate, and they will do jack shit. I thought this was an issue of enemy size, right? T-Rex enemies, you can't use Tesla coils against them. You can't use them against Grave Ward. You can't use them against Tyrene. You can't use them against any large-sized enemies. And I just thought, oh, well, when a character model gets too big, the grenade can't find the attachment point or something. There just isn't one. But when I saw enemies like Katagawa Jr. that just, they don't work, I'd really like to see that fixed. Especially if, you know, they're going to do this nerf to Tesla coil grenades, constantly proccing means of destruction. Because it feels pretty shitty that there doesn't feel like a particularly good boss-killing grenade in this game, even when you're playing a grenade-focused build. So it would be nice to see like a fix for that, and maybe even some kind of improvement to some of the legendary grenades. Maybe something like Epicenter or Firestorm that make them better at actually dealing damage to bosses. For endgame purposes, they really don't feel very effective. I've seen Epicenter do decent damage by kind of shotgunning a larger enemy and having everything sort of hit. I don't know if you've seen Epicenter, but it shoots. I'll just show you. This thing shoots almost like a anointed zealot's attack, right? It shoots a big ring, and you can throw this thing and have it detonate right, almost like inside of an enemy, and have a whole bunch of those spheres hit the enemy at once. Also, it doesn't seem like they're capable of doing splash damage. Right, they just go right through you. I don't know why that is. I'm glad because they go pretty far. But point is, she needs a better avenue of like a better boss killing grenade, because none of them really seem to fill that purpose. And we can't even really use our Tesla coil grenades because for some reason they just don't work against bosses. So I'd like to see that fixed. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Moze at the moment. I think she's really powerful, but I think she's sort of skating by on some incredibly powerful interactions that may or may not need to get nerfed. But she also has some really serious issues with her action skill, which is limiting her access to anointments, which in turn is making her feel a little bit stale at endgame because you really have very little incentive to farm anointed gear, which is the final gear chase at the moment. And it really just doesn't matter to her. I think that's unfortunate. So I hope that they make some changes to her, and I hope that they are careful in the changes they do make. And hopefully we will see an improved Moze on the other side of all that. On the other hand, maybe they will just leave this shit forever, and hopefully they'll just fix Tesla coil grenades so they'll work on bosses. I feel like there's a good chance Iron Bear really never gets the treatment that he's going to need to be relevant forever. So at a minimum, you know, maybe they can give us the ability to drop Iron Bear directly in Auto Bear mode and at least save this issue of anointments being so pointless for her. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this video up. I think this is pretty close to the end of my Moze playthrough. I don't have any more content to experience at the moment, and like I said, the gear chase doesn't really feel that great on her at the moment, just because, you know, I've already got a Incendiary Butcher, and an Anointed Butcher is just not going to mean anything to me. So I'll probably be moving on to Zane next. When I'm at this point in the end game, I'll probably be doing another build guide for Zane, assuming I find some interesting interactions with him. Yeah, click all the YouTube buttons, I guess. There's like bells and whistles and shit. Or feel free to stop by my Twitch channel. I'm still streaming. Trying to stream every day, but it's turning out to be more like every other day lately. I'm kind of busy at the moment in, you know, real life, quote unquote. And you'll probably catch me playing, you know, my Zane, getting him through to level 50 and working on endgame. And then we'll see where it goes from there. I think we have some Halloween content coming up too, so that'll be interesting. Anyway, guys, until next time, take it easy.